in acting, your acting coach or your director would come up to you and make sure that you understood what was going on in this scene. And what was your relationship to the other person? What was your intention in that conversation? What were the tactics you were going to use to realize your objective? Because your objective is another key part of it. And what was at stake if you didn't get it? Like, so that's just sort of a framework for how you might approach, how an actor might approach a scene. Well, it's really no different for how someone might approach a moment as a cold caller, or when someone's knocking on a door and someone comes to the door. There's all sorts of different ways that you're going to end up having to overcome some of the different things thrown at you. And the more that you can have some exposure to that in advance, you can go in with a certain confidence, like, well, when I get that, I've seen it before. I know how to handle it.
You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the E-Marketing Association Power Marketing podcasts. Here's Kevin.
I'm super jazzed to be chatting with Ed Kerr, who founded a platform called Practis. You may recognize him from his acting role, but that actually dovetails perfectly into the catalyst for why he started Practis. So, Ed, if you can sort of tell the story about how you took what you learned about script reading and script interpretation and honing your acting skills and how that became the catalyst for Practis, that'd be great.
Hey, Kevin, thanks. Yeah, so this could be kind of a long, circuitous story here, but I'll try to keep it brief. So yeah, I was an actor for 20 years full time, and kind of accidentally fell into technology development. We set out to build an acting machine a few years ago. And in the process, ended up where we are today. But initially, we wanted to build a way for people to act together, phone to phone. And we wanted people to be able to have conversations with recordings of other people that felt like they were happening live. So at the core of it was something that we call a conversation simulator. We ended up getting patents around it. Then we ended up making deals with movie studios so that people could reenact popular movies, scenes from movies together. And it was actually one of the favorite apps of the year for Apple. We built a great product, but we never got critical mass around it. And I think part of the reason was the content that came out of it wasn't highly shareable. It wasn't something that was going to be shared at a high velocity. But and movies aren't necessarily as much social currency as they were when I was growing up. But we also knew that we kind of stumbled upon something really unique, and it was this conversation simulator. And all along, a number of people had come to us and said, this would be great for role play training, for preparing people for sales conversations. So we went out to a number of companies and said, would this be something that interests you? And the response was enthusiastic. And so a few years ago, we started building it and baking it inside a couple of large companies. And as product developers, we had the great luxury of actually iterating this product inside of those large companies. And all it is a way for companies to have a certain level of coordination and transparency and accountability around how their customer conversations are to be conducted. So at the core of our system is this conversation simulator, but it's supported by the ability for a company to begin to codify what their language is. So we think of it really sort of as a professional language learning platform. So the company has certain value propositions or competitive differentiations, or how should their team overcome certain objections. Well, typically, if you have a large organization with a dispersed team out in the field, having any kind of coordination and unification around that message is very difficult. And there's often a large disparity in the skill sets of all of those frontline reps communicating with customers. And traditionally, that's kind of dealt with by managers, hopefully doing some ride along or role play. But very often those managers are overwhelmed, and those frontline reps are kind of left to their own devices, and they'll end up winging it. So we thought like we could create a system that could provide a certain level of coordination around that. And most importantly, bring a practice component into sales organizations, because typically training is front loaded and incomplete, and people are out into the field and they're not skilled enough to really articulate what they've learned. So we think of it as a place where people can practice transferring knowledge into conversation.
Yeah, and they've done movies about like folks who go out and sell homeowners things, but usually in those types of sales organizations, the people doing the selling are very different from the people who actually deliver the service. So if it's siding, I'm pretty sure there was a movie about siding salesmen and something like that. But obviously in a lot of categories, the folks who come out to do the service, whatever the service is on your home, sometimes they have to put the sales hat on, and it's those people that it seems like are the real beneficiaries of this, because their primary profession is doing that thing, not upselling the person into the service plan or upselling the person into a more pruning of their bushes or whatever. And you know, what kind of lift would you see when you take a person who's never had sales training in their life, or maybe a few ride-alongs, and you really enable them with the opportunity to get more comfortable with the talking points and get more comfortable with the conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one thing that we've really focused on. We've in the initial stages of this business, we focused on home services companies, typically, and commercial services companies. And they typically have a large number of technicians who are out in the field, very often servicing private residences. And they really have the best knowledge of that property, might have the best relationship with that homeowner. And they're really in a great position to make observations and make recommendations on things that could be purchased by the homeowner. But they're often very reluctant to, either because they're more focused on their operational duties, or they're just not comfortable initiating those conversations. So we like to think that our system is something that can empower people who could be sellers, but aren't typically engaged in selling on a daily basis. And we don't even really think of it as selling. It's really more, can you conduct a conversation that could lead to a sale? And so in our system, a company can begin to essentially script out what might be the best way to initiate that conversation, and the right questions to ask of the customer, because conversational interaction is an art, and it's something that unfortunately a lot of younger people aren't as adept at doing. They've grown up texting, and so. Our system is very, very simple. I think of it like Cliff Notes, or giving people the answers to the tests, giving people the ability to tap into the organizational intelligence of a company, and to be able to literally get practice, repetition on how should I engage someone in this conversation. And if I'm a technician and I notice that there's perhaps an opportunity to recommend something to a customer, I'm an expert in my field, and as a service of that homeowner, I should be able to actually articulate what it is I see and what I would recommend they do. So we're just trying to get people more comfortable conversationally. And
it sounds like having the app will facilitate that. One of the questions I have that relates to it, however, is people don't want to feel like they're canned. They're speaking off of talking points and it's canned. So how does the repetition help smooth the rough edges, right? And get to the person to where they don't feel like they're working off of a script or working off of the talking points?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think that, most people who might react and say, oh, this sounds very scripted, are the same people that might object if you were taking a golf lesson and you were taught a new grip. And of course, it's going to feel horrible at first. And if you went out and tried to play golf with that new grip, it'd be a disaster. But you've got to practice it. Or if, let's say, you're right-handed and I asked you to brush your teeth with your left hand, it would not feel normal at first. But after about X number of times doing it, you begin to get good at it. And what we're trying to do is empower people with what we know are the best techniques. So these aren't just words; these are also the proper approach to a conversation in terms of developing a relationship, getting the right information from someone. Because any conversation that you have, typically, there's a goal to it. There's a strategy. There is intent. And then there's the execution of that. And so I think a lot of salespeople and a lot of perhaps underskilled communicators go into conversations and wing it. And I think they need a framework. They need some guidance. And it's really the responsibility of the organization to say, hey, these are the conversations that our people are having every day. And this is how we'd like to help them have those conversations. So it's been interesting when we go into a company, very often we'll ask 100 of their people, for example, to give us in their own words the way they might overcome a certain common objection. And it's shocking. We'll see that typically 50 to even 70% of the people don't know how to answer that question or overcome that objection. And when you think about that, when you think of the numerous times that they're having interactions with a customer and they're not hitting the mark, after all the work that gets them in front of that customer. So we think that we can provide some visibility and establish essentially a standard of excellence or fluency around that company's language.
If I'm remembering correctly, from what you had showed me earlier, there's also a feature where the sort of trainee can continue to use the application, use the app, do the videos, and then when they feel like they've reached that point where they're good enough, they can submit it to a supervisor for review. And I'd love to sort of understand more about that process, because that's also really unique in that, the person really is doing it in front of the audience of one themselves until they're ready. And then when they feel like they're satisfied, then they can sort of push it to their supervisors. Does that make them feel more comfortable with the training process?
It does. And it also goes back to that whole thing around a script, and just not to get too off track, but this kind of goes back to my experience as an actor. Actors, when they learn their lines, they learn them by speaking them. But they first have to understand what they're saying and why. And then they literally need to run their lines. And you run them with someone else. It's not just rote memorization. And so in our system, we want to get people talking, but we want to get them started with the proper framework and started speaking the right language. And it's less about really word for word, verbatim recitation of something, as much as it's getting comfortable practicing having that conversation and being in that conversational situation. And so when a learner gets assigned something in practice, it is all script based, and they're in what is essentially a teleprompter, and they're reading from that. And through repetition, they're encouraged to slowly go down to doing it with just keywords and then practicing without the script. And when they feel confident, they do it on camera without the script, and then they have to achieve a minimum score in order to submit that to their supervisor. So we wanted to create a psychologically safe space where people could be as bad as they want to be, and they can immediately watch the playback. So we think of it kind of as a smart mirror. They're able to see and hear what the customer sees and hears. And so very often we're our own worst critic. That's kind of tough for people to see sometimes, but I say a lot. Hopefully I haven't said it a lot in the conversation we're having, but
we're in the same club on that one, by the way.
Right. So we just wanted to give people a ready resource in the palm of their hand where they can go in and for 5, 10, 15 minutes a shot, just get some repetition. And we called it practice very intentionally, because no one gets good at anything without practice. I mean, why does Steph Curry still shoot free throws before every game? The greatest shooter in history, and he still does that. And it's because it's important to kind of keep that saw sharp, and to revisit some of the fundamentals. And what better way than to also borrow from some of the best techniques of other people in the company. And that's another part, is really kind of crowd sharing those winning techniques and conversations that other people are having.
Yeah, I can see it being really powerful for a variety of organizations that have folks out in the front lines. But interestingly, I can also see it in other niches. For example, media training, right? CEOs consistently go through media training with PR professionals. And currently they just do it face to face pretty much, or maybe Zoom to Zoom. But I can see where this could also be useful in those kinds of repetitive scenarios, because these days investors are grading the CEOs based on first impressions. And if the first impression is bad, either the stock's going to go down or they won't get their funding. So there are a bunch of other opportunities, I think, to use the same framework. But I agree with you. The big opportunity is taking the situation where there are missed opportunities as a result of people just not knowing how to deal with an objection or a difficult conversation, and move that conversation forward, not in a pushy way, because the reality is that person probably needs the thing that they're just not being suggested by the folks in the field.
Mm-hmm.
What other industries do you think this will be most appropriate for? I mean, I was, I wait staffed during college, and so I think maybe I had like a 5-minute prep on how to try to get the people upsold into alcohol and or dessert, and that was it, right? So if I was comfortable pitching the alcohol or pitching the dessert, I could increase the check size and my tip size pretty dramatically, right? And then there were a whole bunch of folks I'd be with who wouldn't do it, and they would suffer. So there's probably a lot of industries where just the difference between the mediocre person and the top quartile is pretty significant.
Yeah, and I think we're working with a restaurant right now, and we're exploring that. And I think we're finding lots of different places where it can be really effectively utilized. And it comes down to confidence, coordination, preparation around communication. And I think that if you were a waiter in a restaurant and you needed to be able to tell the story of that restaurant, or maybe you need to be skilled at handling someone who wants to send their food back, or someone who's unhappy about something, or you want to upsell the newest wine. Well, you're not a sommelier. Do you know how to at least speak to the wine in an intelligent way? Can you just wing that? Well, if you do, well, then I don't know, that might not go so well. So, and I think probably before I stood in front of a table of 10 people asking me about the latest Pinot, I'd want to have a couple of shots at practicing what I was going to say. That
Right.
probably give me a little bit more confidence. And I think that's the biggest thing, is we're trying to empower people to be more confident and more capable communicators. And I think there's obviously tons of room for it in any large dispersed group of communicators, whether it's in medical device or pharma or insurance. When I was a young person, before I got into acting, I actually worked for an insurance company when I was in college, and I had to learn all the best practice language. And this was very well thought out and documented language around how that insurance company explained their services and why they were different from others. And I wish I would have had something like practice back then, because back then I just had to look at a textbook and try to, learn it myself. So I think our way of learning it is much more effective.
Do you feel like certain organization types and or sizes will have a better internal sort of management footprint, like internal sales trainers that might be able to accelerate adoption of this, versus folks where there's less of a best practice already established?
I do. I think that we've worked with some smaller companies who don't have established playbooks or even an L&D group. And some of those can use it very tactically. So, for example, if there is a particular communication challenge, maybe it is a product rollout of some kind, maybe it's a promotion or it's a specific sales initiative, then we can work with them to pretty quickly create a playbook around that. What are the key talking points? What sort of conversations or objections can we anticipate? And we can literally craft messaging, or they on their own can do it. It's a very, very simple system to use, and they can get that messaging out really quickly. And with large organizations, in fact, we worked with one company that had the challenge of changing the way that they wrap up a sale. And it was a pretty significant shift, although it didn't require a lot of language, but they needed to get everybody on message. And they were all working remotely. And so we were able to craft that messaging with their subject matter experts and get it out to everyone. And within 10 days, the entire organization across the country was on message on how to conduct the wrap up of that sale. So whether it's in a tactical sense, or just as a something that can support the reinforcement of whatever they already have in their training protocol. And I'll just say one more thing. So many companies, when they're onboarding new hires, it might be 2 weeks or 2 months where they're getting trained. They're getting a ton of information. Well, we know they're not retaining much of that. And then once they're out on their own, there's not much to reinforce that. So a lot of the L&D people that see Practis get excited about it because it allows us to really reinforce a lot of the hard work that they do so that those learnings stick. And so that most importantly, those learnings can be conversationally shared with the customer.
Yeah, I mean, it's when I see the app and sort of how powerful repetition is in improving one's communication skills, I'm almost waiting for the high-end dating coaches to white label it, because if you really want to sell something, you got to figure out how to sell it into that community.
Well, I will say one of our early investors, who's a good buddy of mine, he said, "I want the rights to this for pickup lines at a bar," because he could.
Right.
I said, "Okay, you can have that. We're probably never going down that path." But you know, he was half joking, but half serious, I think. So,
Yeah.
You know, you think about how many conversational interactions you have every day. I mean, gosh, I could use it for conflict resolution with my wife sometimes. Don't tell her I said that. But you know, there are effective ways to communicate conversationally. And a lot of people just need a little bit of structure and guidance around those. And very often some of those conversations also include informations around price or technical issues around a product or its use or implementation. And so we're trying to simplify all that so that people have a roadmap to follow and an understanding of where they want to go within those conversations.
Yeah, I've gone through 3 different sales training courses over the years with different types of organizations, and they all have their separate frameworks. And what's interesting is the one common denominator for all of them is practicing that framework, right? Yeah. So whether it's Sandler or whether it's Carnegie or, you know, my latest favorite is the Black Swan Group, right? Where it's the former hostage negotiator came up with a framework to talk to people. And they all sort of require that you have gone through the repetition sufficiently that it becomes second nature. And that requires a fairly high level of practice. I don't know if it's the 1,000 hours that people say that you have to practice in order to be really good at something. Maybe that's for acting, but certainly putting the time in is going to make a huge difference.
Yeah, it's I just think there's no replacement for it, and no one gets good at anything without practice. And unfortunately, most companies are putting their people out in front of customers and letting their people practice on their customers. And some figure it out, but a lot of them don't, and it leads to sales reluctance and to to a lot of lost opportunities and to really big time retention issues with companies. So, can we get people up to speed faster? Can we provide them with the support that they need, a lifeline when they're out there on their own in the field? And so many people now are recruited, hired, and operate remotely. And certainly COVID made that obviously much more commonplace than it was prior to the pandemic. And so I think one thing that we found that a lot of the people that are using Practis currently in the companies we're working with now, they do feel like they have an attachment to their coworkers, maybe even clear across the country. They're all in that shared struggle of, hey, we work for this company. Why do we work for this company? What do we have to say about our company and our products and our services? And can we learn from one another and all be really kind of buttoned up and on the same message and feel strongly feel confident about it?
Yeah, I think you made a really important point there about the reduction in employee churn, right? I mean, even if you have one of those types of organizations, which is like a sink or swim sales organization, and there's a lot of industries and or companies that sort of had to adopt that sink or swim mindset or, and churn through their employees. There's no need in some cases, like those people with the right training and with the right tools, some of those folks who flunk out could be saved.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we found also that it's been really impactful with young people, because a lot of young people, and I think it's because of growing up texting so much, they haven't really developed a lot of this basic conversation skills. And so I don't know if they're skilled enough to understand how to frame a conversation and how to get and give information in a way that that leads to a shared understanding and alignment around the go forward. And so I think this can be really helpful, like training wheels for conversation. And so I think that's one thing that we found. And then the other thing is that when you have some sort of a framework to follow, I think there's something, I'm trying to think of the word, but it's around how discipline ultimately creates freedom. And that's not the right quote, but rather than looking at it as something that's restrictive or limiting, you can look at it as something that once you've got this muscle memory and this comfort around this framework and some of this terminology, I think it really allows you to free you up to imbue it with your own personality and to focus more on the person you're speaking with, because you're not worried about the words you're saying. You've already kind of mastered that in a way. So
I'm imagining that some of the folks who go through and use this in a work environment, who are perhaps socially anxious in general, that it might actually flow out into their regular life, right? I don't know if you've heard any of that stories from the grapevine yet, but just you don't need to only learn this for your work life. I mean, it could make you generally less socially anxious just as you start to get more comfortable chatting with folks.
I think so. I often think of the old Karate Kid. Remember the wax on, wax off, and he never knew why he was washing these cars. And all of a sudden, he just kind of deployed it in a martial arts setting. And so, I think the most important thing that I like about our system is we want people to understand what the goal of the conversation is. What is their objective? Because, like, for example, in acting, your acting coach or your director would come up to you and make sure that you understood what was going on in this scene, and what was your relationship to the other person, what was your intention in that conversation, what were the tactics you were going to use to realize your objective, because your objective is another key part of it, and what was at stake if you didn't get it. Like, so that's just sort of a framework for how you might approach how an actor might approach a scene. Well, it's really no different for how someone might approach a moment as a cold caller, or when someone's knocking on a door and someone comes to the door. There's all sorts of different ways that you're going to end up having to overcome some of the different things thrown at you. And the more that you can have some exposure to that in advance, you can go in with a certain confidence, like, well, when I get that, I've seen it before. I know how to handle it. And that's all. We're just trying to empower people. And I think it can be tough out there when young people, especially when they get these new jobs and they really kind of are thrown to the wolves. And so hopefully Practis is a place where they can go and have some the ability to empower themselves.
Yeah, when you tied it back to acting training again, it made me curious about the other elements of communication, which are not purely verbal, right? Which is, body language, facial expression, et cetera. So how does the app help people get optimized from that perspective?
Yeah, great question. It doesn't quite right now. And I think that's something that we're looking forward to developing as we go forward. I think there's a lot of technological enhancements that are going to make that a possibility 2-3 years from now, with digital twins and introducing those into a mobile application. But right now, it's really about listening to certain cues and looking for certain cues. So you're still imparting information. You're still hopefully getting information and synthesizing all of that to lead someone to a conclusion. And in that process, you're looking for cues, listening for cues, watching facial expressions. But if you already have a strong sense of and confidence around what you're there to share with them, then I think you'll be able to pull from your quiver, and your quiver that's been well developed because you've learned that language. And I think that's where having confidence around whatever particular information that you have to share with someone, and the techniques around that, having that, the repetition around that allows you to be free to really watch for that. You know, a lot of people don't have high EQ. They're not that skilled at looking for, well, am I going over too long? Like, I hope I'm not right now. Is Kevin bored with me right now? But if you already are confident around why you're there and what you have to share, then I think that it allows you to sit back and really focus on the person you're communicating with, and not what you think you're trying to remember what to say. So again, it's just, you've got to get in the batting cage.
Yeah, that was actually one of my favorite lines of Chris Voss and the Black Swan Group, which is, if you're too busy thinking about what you're going to say next, you're not paying attention to the person who's talking to you, right? So it's through the repetition and practicing that you can already have, you're ready with what you're going to say next, and you can concentrate more on listening about what the person's saying and less on what your response is going to be. And I do think perhaps just the pure repetition alone just will make people more comfortable and solve perhaps some of the more anxious facial expressions and other problems that a person might have as a result of not having trained themselves.
Yeah, I completely agree. And one of the ways that content is typically set up in our system is our core unit of currency is something we call a scenario. And a scenario can be a statement. It can be a talk track of any length. It can be an answer to a common question. And those scenarios can then be thematically grouped into a practice set, which is our kind of our learning module. And within that, you can really structure content in a way that I think captures lots of different aspects of a conversational approach. And I think just being immersed in those and seeing the conversation from some of these different angles is incredibly helpful. And I think, when we bring on and train new salespeople, they can't possibly have the kind of awareness with this product that I have, because I've been developing it from the beginning. And so how do I get them to a certain level of understanding? Well, it starts with the concept. What is the concept? What are we doing here? And what is our essence? And how is that communicated? And I think for some reason, I don't know why, but I think with a lot of companies that I see out there, sometimes that's lost. Sometimes the core message, whether it's around the company itself, a product or a service, it's lost. And some of the other things that are lost are how their people are encouraged to genuinely seek out, have genuine interest in and seek out the needs of their customers or their prospects. And through our system, we can actually kind of begin to not necessarily indoctrinate, although there's a partial indoctrination, but at least give them an active way of learning to kind of discover that, if you will. So I don't know if that makes sense, but
it does. I can't remember which of the sales trainers said it. It might have been in one of the books, but one thing that struck home with me, because obviously there's reluctance in many cases to engage in a sales conversation, especially if it's an awkward scenario. But one of the sales books, I think, said, if you really think the person needs what you are trying to decide whether to bring up, you're doing them a disservice if you don't mention it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that for me was like a big wake-up call where I was actually being mean to them by not bringing it up, right? So wait a minute, like I don't want to be mean, I want to be nice. So it was sort of flipped it upside down. Like, no, if you don't do it, you're doing them a disservice by not bringing it up.
Well, and that's actually one of the ways that I think some of the companies that we're working with are getting their technicians more involved in the selling process, because they don't want them to think of it as selling. Right. I mean, you're a caretaker of that person's property in many aspects, or if you're, delivering and installing something, there's a service you're providing. And if there's an opportunity to make the customer aware of other things that they should be, that they could benefit from, then yes, you're denying that opportunity if you don't bring it up to them. So, but I also think another big part of that, when you mentioned someone's need, we found that in a lot of sales training content, it tends to be, in many cases, much more driven by marketing, and they're just features and benefits. And so a lot of salespeople go out and spout features and benefits without really any understanding of whether the customer needs it or not. So if I'm selling you a hammer and you really just want a banana, it might be the best hammer in the world, but you've got 5 hammers in your garage. So I think what's been great about our system is when we can help people learn the process of revealing a need and validating a need. And regardless of whether you want my solution or not, let me just explain what mine is. But let's first confirm that there's a need there. And I think just that kind of understanding and an approach to a conversation, I don't want people to use practice to learn how to tell and sell. I want them to learn how to connect and communicate. And I think that's something that we can do really effectively with our system.
Well, that's fascinating, and I look forward to watching the continued evolution of the platform and its success as it gets deployed out across the ecosystem.
Thank you. Well, thanks for the opportunity, Kevin. I really appreciate it.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in The Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.